In the grand, echoing halls of the British Museum, history seems calm, almost obedient. Glass cases stand like silent sentinels, holding fragments of civilizations long gone. Visitors drift past them in quiet reverence, absorbing stories that appear complete, carefully arranged, and indisputable. But beneath this stillness lies something far less orderly, a hidden narrative of ambition, conflict, and power that has never truly settled. And one that raises a question the museum itself cannot fully answer. What if these objects were never meant to be here at all? By the late 17th century, the British Empire had begun its transformation into one of the most expansive forces the world had ever known. Its ships crossed oceans with precision and purpose, linking continents through trade routes that were as profitable as they were exploitative. From the coasts of West Africa to the dense markets of India, British influence extended not only through diplomacy, but through domination. Entire societies were drawn into its orbit, sometimes willingly, often not reshaped by a system that prioritized wealth, control, and expansion above all else. Yet land and labor were only part of the equation. Empire, at its core, was also about possession, about collecting the physical expressions of human identity. Objects became trophies of influence, sacred carvings, ceremonial masks, ancient manuscripts, and intricate metalworks. These were not random acquisitions. They were carefully selected pieces of culture, stripped from their original contexts and reassembled thousands of miles away. Within institutions like the British Museum, they would be reinterpreted not as fragments of living societies, but as artifacts of a shared global heritage. And so a new kind of empire took shape, one not measured in borders, but in collections. But even as these objects were cataloged and displayed, their origins whispered a different story. Behind each artifact was a journey, and behind each journey, a moment of taking, sometimes negotiated, often coerced, and occasionally seized outright. Visitors rarely saw this side of the narrative. Labels offered dates, materials, and origins, but seldom the circumstances of acquisition. The silence was not accidental. It was part of the presentation, a carefully maintained illusion of neutrality that concealed a far more complicated truth. One that, if fully revealed, might challenge the very foundation of the museum itself. By the 19th century, this quiet accumulation had accelerated into something far more aggressive. Across Europe, imperial powers competed not only for territory, but for cultural dominance. Museums became arenas of prestige, each artifact a symbol of reach and authority. To possess history was to control its narrative. And nowhere was this competition more visible than in the growing collections of London, Paris, and Berlin, cities that transformed into vaults of the world's past. Yet among these countless objects, some carried stories too powerful to remain buried. Stories that refused to be reduced to labels and glass cases. Stories of kingdoms that had not vanished quietly, but had been violently interrupted. One such story begins in West Africa, in a place of immense artistic and political sophistication, the Kingdom of Benin. For centuries, Benin thrived as a center of craftsmanship and governance. Its artisans produced works of astonishing detail, bronze plaques, ivory carvings, and sculptures that recorded the lineage, rituals, and authority of its rulers. These were not mere decorations, they were living archives, embedded with meaning, identity, and power. But in 1897, that world would be shattered. A British military campaign, later known as the Benin Punitive Expedition, was launched in response to a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. What followed was not simply retaliation, it was devastation. Armed forces advanced on Benin City with overwhelming force. The royal palace was stormed. Fires consumed structures that had stood for generations. And in the chaos, thousands of objects, those same works of art that had once defined a civilization, were taken. They would not remain in Benin. They would be shipped, sold, and displayed across Europe, becoming what the world would come to know as the Benin Bronzes. And as the flames died down and the artifacts disappeared into foreign hands, a new chapter of history began, one not written in bronze or ivory, but in absence. an absence that would echo across generations, leaving behind a question that still lingers today. If history can be taken, can it ever truly be returned? Before we continue deeper into this story of fire, loss, and legacy, take a moment to support the channel, like the video, and subscribe. It helps bring stories like this to a wider audience, ensuring that histories once hidden are finally heard. By the late 19th century, the map of Africa was no longer shaped by its people alone. European powers, driven by ambition and rivalry, carved the continent into territories with little regard for the civilizations that already existed. This period, known as the Scramble for Africa, was not a gradual process, but a rapid and aggressive reordering of an entire continent. Borders were drawn in distant capitals, treaties were signed without consent, and sovereignty was redefined by force. Yet even within this storm of expansion, there remained powerful states that resisted, endured, and maintained their traditions, at least for a time. Until one kingdom, in particular, found itself on a collision course with empire in a way that would change its fate forever. Deep in what is now southern Nigeria stood the Kingdom of Benin, a highly organized and sophisticated society with a political system centered around its ruler, the Aba. Benin City itself was a marvel, described by early European visitors as orderly and expansive, with broad streets and impressive architecture. But it was the kingdom's artistry that truly set it apart. Skilled craftsmen, working within royal guilds, produced intricate bronze plaques, commemorative heads, and ivory carvings that documented court rituals, historical events, and the divine authority of the monarchy. These works were not static relics, they were active participants in the kingdom's spiritual and political life, connecting the present to the past in ways that could not be easily replaced. At the same time, British interest in the region was intensifying. Trade, particularly in palm oil, had become increasingly valuable to European industries. But trade alone was not enough. Control, direct, unquestioned control was the ultimate goal. Tensions between British officials and Benin's leadership grew steadily, fueled by misunderstandings, economic pressure, and competing visions of authority. Diplomatic relations became strained, and by the 1890s, the situation had reached a fragile and dangerous tipping point. Then in January 1897, everything changed. A British delegation, led by Acting Consul General James Robert Phillips, set out for Benin City despite warnings not to proceed during a sacred period. The mission was presented as diplomatic, but its true intentions remain debated among historians. As the party approached the city, they were ambushed by Benin forces. Several members of the delegation were killed in what would soon be labeled the Benin disaster. News of the attack spread rapidly, igniting outrage within British circles. But beneath the outrage was something else, an opportunity, one that would be seized with overwhelming force, and with consequences far beyond retaliation. Within weeks, Britain launched the Benin Punitive Expedition. This was no small operation. Hundreds of heavily armed troops, equipped with modern weaponry, advanced toward Benin City with a singular objective: to capture and subdue. The expedition was swift, methodical, and devastating. Villages along the route were destroyed, resistance was met with lethal force. And when British troops finally reached the city, what followed would leave an indelible mark on history. Benin City was overwhelmed. The royal palace, heart of the kingdom's cultural and political life, was looted. Fires spread rapidly, consuming buildings, sacred spaces, and centuries of accumulated history. In the aftermath, thousands of artifacts were seized: bronze plaques that once adorned palace walls, sculpted heads that honored past rulers, and ivory works that carried spiritual significance. These objects, created over generations, were removed in a matter of days. But this was not chaos, it was calculated. The artifacts were carefully collected, inventoried, and transported. Many were later sold to offset the cost of the expedition itself. Others were distributed to museums and private collectors across Europe, where they would be reclassified not as stolen heritage, but as ethnographic treasures. Within institutions like the British Museum, they became part of a growing narrative, one that celebrated global collection while obscuring the violence that made it possible. And as these objects found new homes behind glass, something else was left behind, an absence that could not be catalogued. The Aba of Benin was exiled, the kingdom's political structure was dismantled. Its cultural continuity was fractured in ways that extended far beyond physical destruction. What had once been a living, evolving civilization was reduced to fragments, its most significant expressions scattered across continents, its voice muted within its own homeland. Yet even in this silence, the memory endured, because these were never just objects, they were witnesses. Witnesses to a moment when history was not preserved but taken. Witnesses to a fire that did more than burn a city, it reshaped the destiny of a people. And as the bronzes sat quietly in distant museums, admired for their beauty but separated from their meaning, a question began to take shape, one that would grow louder with each passing generation. What happens when a civilization's memory is removed from its own soil, and who has the right to decide its fate? In the years that followed the destruction of Benin City, the world moved on, at least it appeared to. Within Europe's grand institutions, the newly acquired artifacts were cleaned, catalogued, and displayed with meticulous care. Inside the British Museum and other major collections across Germany and France, the Benin Bronzes were no longer symbols of a living kingdom. They became exhibits admired for their craftsmanship, studied for their detail, and framed within a narrative that distanced them from the violence of their removal. Yet behind the quiet admiration of museum halls, a deeper silence settled in, a silence that concealed not just the past, but the voices of those to whom these objects truly belonged. And that silence would last far longer than anyone expected. Back in West Africa, the Kingdom of Benin had been irrevocably altered. British colonial rule replaced indigenous governance, reshaping political and social structures to fit imperial design. The Aba, once a central figure of authority and spiritual continuity, returned from exile under restricted power, his influence diminished within a system no longer his own. Generations grew up in a world where the physical anchors of their history, the plaques, carvings, and sacred objects, were no longer present. What remained were fragments of memory, passed down through oral tradition, struggling to preserve what had been taken in a matter of days. When Nigeria finally gained independence in 1960, it marked the end of formal colonial rule, but not the return of everything that had been lost. The Benin Bronzes, scattered across Europe and beyond, remained where they had been placed decades earlier. For many Nigerians, these objects became distant realities known through textbooks, photographs, or second-hand accounts, but rarely seen in person. To encounter them often required travel across continents, a journey that underscored the imbalance of access and ownership that empire had left behind. In museums, however, the narrative remained largely unchanged. The bronzes were presented as part of a shared human heritage, their origins acknowledged, but their displacement rarely interrogated. Visitors stood before them, marveling at their complexity, unaware that these objects were never meant to be isolated behind glass. They had once been part of a living system integrated into rituals, ceremonies, and the daily life of a kingdom. Removed from that context, they became something else entirely. Admired but disconnected, preserved yet profoundly displaced. And as decades passed, the distance between object and origin seemed to grow, not just physically, but conceptually. A generation emerged for whom the presence of African artifacts in European museums felt normal, even inevitable. The idea of restitution, of returning these works to their place of origin, remained on the margins, discussed by scholars and activists, but rarely embraced by major institutions. It was as if the passage of time itself had been used to justify permanence. As if history, once taken, could simply be absorbed into a new narrative without consequence. Yet beneath this surface of acceptance, pressure was quietly building. By the late 20th century, voices from Nigeria and across the African continent began to challenge the status quo with increasing clarity and urgency. Historians, cultural leaders, and members of the Benin royal family spoke not only of loss, but of identity of what it meant for a people to be separated from the very objects that defined their history. These were not calls rooted in nostalgia. They were demands grounded in justice, in recognition, and in the fundamental right to reclaim what had been taken under conditions that could no longer be ignored. The conversation began to shift. What had once been framed as a question of preservation started to transform into a question of accountability. Museums, long seen as neutral guardians of history, were now being re-examined as participants in a system of extraction. The Benin Bronzes, once silent behind glass, became symbols of a much larger debate, one that extended far beyond a single collection or institution. And as this debate gained momentum, it revealed something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The story of these objects was not over, it had simply been paused. By the dawn of the 21st century, the stillness that had long surrounded the Benin Bronzes began to fracture. What had once been quiet discussions among historians and cultural advocates evolved into a global conversation, one that questioned not only where these artifacts were, but why they remained there at all. In museums like the British Museum, the bronzes still stood in carefully lit displays, but their presence now carried a different weight. Visitors were no longer just asking what these objects were, they were beginning to ask how they got there and whether they were ever meant to stay. In 2000, a formal request emerged from representatives of the Kingdom of Benin, including members of the royal family. Their message was clear and deliberate. The Benin Bronzes were not simply works of art, they were cultural memory, sacred history, and identity made tangible. Their removal had not been an exchange, but an active force tied to the Benin Punitive Expedition. To keep them, they argued, was to continue the legacy of that act. Yet despite the clarity of this appeal, the response from major institutions remained cautious, measured, and, at times, resistant, raising a difficult question that institutions were not yet ready to fully confront. For decades, the British Museum and others upheld a central argument that they served as universal museums, places where the world's cultures could be preserved and accessed by a global audience. In this view, the bronzes were part of a shared human story, their presence in London justified by visibility and conservation. But critics saw something different. They saw an imbalance, a system in which the legacy of empire continued to shape who had access to history and who did not. The debate was no longer confined to academic circles. It entered public discourse, media coverage, and international diplomacy, growing louder with each passing year. Then in 2007, a new initiative signaled a shift in tone. The Benin Dialogue Group was formed, bringing together European museums and Nigerian representatives to discuss the future of the bronzes. It was not a resolution, but it was a beginning, a recognition that the issue could no longer be ignored. Conversations turned toward potential loans, shared exhibitions, and, in some cases, the possibility of permanent returns. For the first time in over a century, the idea of restitution began to move from theory into tangible action. And yet, even as progress seemed possible, deeper tensions remained unresolved. In the years that followed, individual acts hinted at change. Some institutions and private holders began returning pieces from their collections, acknowledging the circumstances under which they had been taken. Governments, particularly in Europe, faced increasing pressure to address colonial-era acquisitions. Germany, for example, took steps toward returning significant portions of its Benin collections. These actions, while limited in scale, carried symbolic weight. They suggested that the narrative was shifting, that what had once been accepted as permanent might, in fact, be reversible. But the central question still lingers. The British Museum, home to some of the most prominent Benin works, has maintained its position, constrained in part by legal frameworks and institutional policy. The bronzes remain, their future uncertain, suspended between competing visions of history, one that emphasizes global access and another that demands rightful return. And as negotiations continue, they reveal a deeper truth. This is not merely a dispute over objects. It is a reckoning with the legacy of empire itself, a confrontation with histories that were once obscured but can no longer remain hidden. Because at its core, this story is about more than the past, it is about the present and the future. It is about who has the authority to tell history, to preserve it, and to decide where it belongs. The Benin Bronzes have become more than artifacts. They are symbols of a global conversation about justice, memory, and identity. And as that conversation unfolds, it forces institutions, nations, and individuals alike to reconsider long-held assumptions. The past, it seems, is not fixed. It is contested, it is alive, and perhaps most importantly, it is still being negotiated.